Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I'm your host, curator Kevin Adkisson, with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today is our first Live at 5 coming to you technically off campus from Christ Church Cranbrook. Christ Church Cranbrook, if you've watched Live at 5 long enough, or if you know Cranbrook well and know the Cranbrook story, you know that Christ Church Cranbrook is really integral to the entire Cranbrook educational community's formation. This is the reason we have a school for boys. It's the reason we then had to have a school for girls. The Art Academy, Eliel Saarinen, considered it to be like a cathedral workshop, and many of the religious objects at Christ Church Cranbrook came from the Cranbrook Arts and Crafts Studios. So hopefully one day in the future, I'll be able to do a longer tour on the interior of Christ Church Cranbrook, the great sort of arts and crafts temple that it is. But right now, the national bishop has closed all American Episcopal churches, so we can't go inside. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the outside of the church, and then also an important story that I think is really relevant to today and what's happening in the world. So Christ Church Cranbrook sits directly adjacent the main 319 acres of Cranbrook's campus. Just to the left is the entrance to Cranbrook House and the main campus. That's Lone Pine Road in front of it. The architect of Christ Church Cranbrook, Bertram Goodhue, the famed New York Gothic and early modernist, was hired to design Christ Church Cranbrook. However, he died the same year that the commission was given to him, so it was completed by the office of Bertram Goodhue to designs of Goodhue's chief assistant, Oscar Murray. Ground was broken in 1925, the cornerstone was laid in 1926, and services began in 1928, with the Christ Church Cranbrook being consecrated in September of 28. Now, the building is a beautiful example of Goodhue's late Gothic modernism. And if you look at the tower, I think we get a sense of Goodhue's development of the Gothic away from sort of rote copying and into something much more streamlined. Notice the tracery is quite minimal. There's these large, smooth surfaces. And then just at the top there are these little sort of remnants of Gothic ornament. But it really reads quite modern as this great stone shaft. I want to draw our attention to the friends that are around Christ Church Cranbrook. This is when I wish I had a drone on my phone so I could take you closer to some of the figures that are carved on both the north and south side of the church. In the corner, we are seeing Leonardo Da Vinci. Next to him on the left is Galileo, and then Copernicus. And then here we see Michael Faraday, who was an English scientist and electrolysis. And then we have the last two figures, Louis Pasteur and Wilbur Wright, the airmen. And Pasteur, I think, is interesting in this moment. We all know him from pasteurization, but Pasteur is also important in creating vaccines, which I think we wish we had Pasteur's mind working on the coronavirus right now. And what's interesting about these figures carved on the church is how many saints did I mention? None on this side of the church. There is the first bishop of Michigan on the other side, the first rector of Christ Church Cranbrook, Samuel Marquis. Washington, Lincoln, William Penn make appearances. But it's men of science, it's men of art, men of religion. It's important figures across the sort of spectrum of human history. And I think that's really reflective of George Booth's idea about this church. This was not to be a sort of traditional or anti-science in any way. He wanted to have Cranbrook be this place where science, art, and religion could all coexist. Now, as I've been watching the news, like all of you, it's heartbreaking, it's horrifying. It's caused me to do so much reflection about privilege and race and my own place and how I can make a better, truer version of America. And so you'll notice that on Tuesday, on Blackout Tuesday, we did not do a live at 5. And I spent that time reading more about equality and about how I can make sure that I not only say Black Lives Matter, but I show that Black Lives Matter. I went to a Zoom webinar last night, and it was kind of amazing to just sit there and listen to other people, to listen to young African Americans talk about what they're feeling and how white allies can be a benefit. And so I really wanted today to talk about art from Cranbrook's campus by Black or minority artists. And I don't know if this is shocking, but it's certainly thought-provoking. And I don't want to draw any conclusions here, but I want to point out that I couldn't find any. So you'll know that majority of Cranbrook's architects are white men, but most of our sculpture is also from white men. Now, if I could go into the museum collection, there is, of course, great art in that collection from Oliver Legrone, Cranbrook's first African-American graduate, who was here in the 1940s, our MacArthur Binion, our Nicholas Cave, and then even more art from recent graduates from all different sort of backgrounds. But without going into the art museum collection, there's nothing on the Cranbrook campus that I could find to help tell the story of Cranbrook and our own history with race and equality. And so I chose to come to Christ Church Cranbrook because I knew a little bit about a story, but I wanted to read more about it. In 1969, there was a conference in Detroit called the National Black Economic Development Conference. And it was gathered by the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, which was a interdenominational Jewish and Christian group of mostly Black leaders who wanted to have a week-long conference on how what was the state of American social justice and religious activity. On the second day of the conference in April of '69, James Foreman, who was a member of the Student National Coordinating Committee, SNCC, he commandeered the conference, and he, along with fellow conference attendees, published the Black Manifesto. And the Black Manifesto demanded reparations from white churches. It shook up any idea of sort of complacency. It was quite socialist, Marxist leaning. It demanded a complete rethinking of American religious life, but also mass public education about race relations in America, disruption of church activities, sit-ins, and seizure of church facilities. And maybe you see where I'm going. The Black Economic Development Conference, so the radical arm took the name, the BEDC. In May of 1969, they interrupted services at Riverside Church in Manhattan. Now, they didn't tell the church that they were interrupting the services. They just showed up and read the Black Manifesto. And on June 1st, 1969, they came to Christ Church Cranbrook, and they also interrupted church services and read the manifesto. Now, when they came to Christ Church Cranbrook, they did not come unannounced. They had called the church the week before and said, "We are coming and we will be reading the Black Manifesto to your congregants." And they reached the fourth rector of Christ Church Cranbrook, Reverend Gerald O'Grady Jr. And O'Grady had been here since 1961. And he asked the leaders to come up to Christ Church Cranbrook the Saturday before the Sunday that they planned to read the manifesto to the congregation. He met with the Black leaders, he heard their sort of plans, and he reviewed the manifesto. And the next morning, he had consulted with Dominic Vitrino, Cranbrook's head of security, and he had told Vitrino, "Don't call the police, this is going to be peaceful." But he did not tell the congregation until about 10 minutes into the 9 a.m. service. And so Mark Hamlin and John Watson, members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, came in after the second hymn. They marched to the podium and they read the complete Black Manifesto. It started with a quite revolutionary preamble, and then it got into the specifics of what the demands of reparation were. There were some 2,300 people at the service that day. I can only imagine my own discomfort in situations where I don't know what to say or how to think. I can just imagine the families who were sitting in the audience stunned that this was happening. And towards the end of the manifesto's reading, they demanded from the Episcopal Church of America $60 million. And so dividing that by all the Episcopal churches, they thought Christ Church Cranbrook owed $100,000 with $10,000 immediately. And they said, religion will not serve as a cloak to oppression of African Americans. Now, they did not pass the collection of plate around next. Hamlin and Watson left. The service went on. At the 11 o'clock service, they played a recording of the 9 a.m. service, so everyone heard the message. And then Reverend O'Grady, he said, we're going to have listening services. We're going to have 4 meetings. Write me letters. I want to hear from you, the members of Christ Church Cranbrook, what to do. The opinions were very mixed. And particularly at the leadership, the Right Reverend Richard Emmerich, the Bishop of Michigan, was really very against the Black Manifesto. But Reverend O'Grady here at Christ Church Cranbrook took a much more even response. The listening sessions were extraordinarily crowded, and he tried to play sort of mediator between the two sides. Those who felt they should acknowledge the Black Manifesto should pay the money, and those who felt that they were essentially being held hostage and that this was extortion. Interestingly, Henry Scripps Booth, the youngest son of Cranbrook's founders George and Ellen Scripps Booth, he fell on the side that the demands were not unreasonable. And he, the day after the Sunday service, wrote a letter to the congregation, and he sent it to the press. Very Henry Booth way of dealing with the problem. And he said, church must be the conscience of America. If we are to overcome its blindness regarding minorities as quickly as possible, we must act with love and generosity. Now, he didn't exactly say that we should give in to the $100,000 demand. The letter is a little bit sort of hot and cold, but he did think we had to do something, and that was sort of the general consensus. However, the Reverend Emmerich, the head bishop of Michigan, was not very compassionate towards the Black Manifesto, and so we came to this sort of standstill. And this is the part of the story that I find most shocking and also most inspiring as we think about what we can do today. As it was becoming more and more clear that Christ Church Cranbrook would not give in to these demands, and that the Episcopal churches of the area were not going to be sort of engaging with the Black Manifesto, including the Right Reverend Emmerich. He was not going to meet with the leaders. 8 housewives from Christ Church Cranbrook and from nearby St. Joseph's and Farmington Hills, including members of the lay leadership, Ruth Mumford and Belle Hargraves, they went down to Woodward Avenue, went to the headquarters of the Episcopal Diocese of Michigan. They brought clothes, they brought soap, they brought food, and they had a sit-in. And for 3 days, they refused to leave the bishop's office until the bishop agreed to meet with the leaders of the Black Economic Development Conference. They had planned to be there for as long as it took, and they had a whole system worked out about how food would be delivered to them. Now, Bishop Emmerich did not kick them out. He said, this is their office now, and he met in a different part of the facility. But all of this was getting press attention, but certainly 8 housewives sitting in on the bishop's office was gathering attention. And the Detroit Free Press wrote that they were surprised such well-to-do homemakers would behave so uncharacteristically to their social standing. And I think it does show us the power of what we can do as allies. Because if it hadn't been for these 8 housewives, the Episcopal Church was probably not going to be engaging with the members and the Black Manifesto. So after 3 days of the sit-in, the bishop did say, "I will meet with the leadership." The sit-in caused just simmering conflict here at Christ Church Cranbrook among the women. Many of the ladies said it was unladylike behavior and overly self-assertive. And it's actually impossible to know what the attitude was by the members of Christ Church Cranbrook. Some national surveys were saying that there was only about a 2% support among white people for the Black Manifesto, and only 22% support among African Americans. It was a document demanding millions or $3 billion in reparations. And reparations then, as they are now, are a very controversial topic. But it does seem like there was agitation for change here at Christ Church Cranbrook. Eventually, there was a federal grand jury, and lawyers from Washington were sent to Detroit, and they began to to subpoena witnesses, and as arguing that the Black Manifesto was extortion. And so they did subpoena Reverend O'Grady, and he went downtown to Detroit and testified as to whether or not he felt he had been extorted. And at the time, many leaders, both Black leaders, church leaders, argued that the federal government was doing this entirely as a political stunt. It was clearly not extortion. Reverend O'Grady did not feel that he had been sort of commandeered against his will by these people. And so eventually the charges were dropped, and it really did nothing to sort of stop the Black Manifesto. Now, O'Grady, writing about this event about a decade after it happened, he said that certainly the occasion was traumatic, but ultimately constructive. He said that now the members of Christ Church know more, they are awake, and they can begin to actively change the world around them. Why did the Black Manifesto get sort of argued for here at Christ Church Cranbrook? Well, I think Cranbrook then, as now, represented a lot of wealth in Metro Detroit. It represented leaders of the auto industry and sort of leaders of Metro Detroit. But Christ Church Cranbrook has also been a pretty darn liberal church already. In fact, Reverend Grady's wife had been arrested in 1964 as part of a civil rights demonstration in Detroit. And there were already multiple sort of divisions within the church that were meant to support Black lives in Detroit, including teaching in the public schools and different charities and organizations in Pontiac and Detroit. What I think is really beautiful about Christ Church Cranbrook, which split from the main Cranbrook educational community in 1973, is that it continues to be a real place of thinking about change and how we can better ourselves. And so if you're interested in learning more about what Christ Church Cranbrook is doing today as far as race and how we can be better allies as white people and how we can make a stronger Detroit, I encourage you to go to their website or to their Facebook group. The Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, of course, is not affiliated with Christ Church Cranbrook. It is an independent Episcopal church today, and we are a independent, non-denominational educational community adjacent to it. I hope that this has been interesting to you. It has certainly been very interesting to me to look up and learn more about this aspect of Cranbrook's history that I knew a little bit about, but really didn't know the whole story. If you want to know more, there are 2 really wonderful articles online. Both are written by Keith Dye, who is a professor at University of Michigan Dearborn. And so you can search Black Manifesto Christ Church Cranbrook, and they'll pull up. One is called The Black Manifesto for Reparations in Detroit from the Michigan Historical Review. And I want to leave you today, encourage you to continue listening to our neighbors and our friends and reading and learning more about what we can do to make this sort of vision and dream of America a more just and equal place. And I wanted to leave you with the words of the current bishop of the Episcopal Church of America, Michael Curry, who is, you may know, the first Black bishop of the American Episcopal Church. And he wrote in an article on May 30th for the Washington Post that frustration must not lead to fatalism or despair. We are not condemned to live this way forever. I recommend a different path, the path of love. So, love one another, better yourselves, and I will see you next Tuesday for another Live at 5.